Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Decode podcast. And today's guest is Jake Bernardes. Jake is the field CISO of Anecdotes, advisor at Token Security and Lasso Security, and also a podcast host of Risking It All. Welcome, Jake. How are you?
I'm good, thanks for having me. It's nice to be back in this chair. I started, like I said, my podcast myself last week, and it's much more fun being the one to ask the questions than the one that's got to work out to fill the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll obviously plug the podcast on here as well, and and I would hope that people would check it out as well, and obviously get to know you a bit better as well as a podcast host. And it's a few people I think in our industry are now starting these podcasts for various different reasons, and yeah, I'm all for it. So I'm really looking forward to catching up on your podcast as well. And yeah, we'll jump right in then, Jake. And if you could give me, a brief overview of who you are and your career.
So my name is Jake Bernardes. I'm currently the field CISO at Anecdotes, which is a conversation we can have later about what a field CISO is. Previously, the CISO at Gutsy, Wistic, and SingleStore, which was formerly known as SQL or MemSQL. Prior to that, I spent a number of years as a consultant and pen tester at NCC Group, at KPMG, and at IBM. Probably, I think, fairly normal as a CISO in as much as my background is non-defined. I started as a pen tester, technical testing, specialism, probably in social engineering, trying to manipulate humans. Physical testing, ended up working in breach response remediation in the Middle East, where I spent a year with my family living in Jordan, or the best part of several months working out there. And then we went for a year to the US, where I ended up doing quite a lot of work in startups in Silicon Valley or San Francisco area. Before I eventually got acquired, quote unquote, by one, and was part of what I think was a fantastic opportunity, an interesting time where I did hyper growth mode. I was employee, I think 50-ish. A SingleStore left at several hundred, and we did most of that during COVID, which made the whole thing a whole lot of interestingness. Other than that, I've got a wife and two children, a little boy and a little girl. Massive sports nut, cyclist, runner, Formula One, football. Just came back from the Euros, which was challenging. And that's
I'm saying nothing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is risky territory to start this conversation with you, but I actually landed on the plane full of Scots. And it was during the first game of the tournament, when Germany beat them quite comfortably. And we got down and landed. We're like, oh, it's just kicked off. And it's 1-0. Clearing immigration, it's 2-0. Picking up bags, it's 3-0. There was a lot of very unhappy Scots by that point, although they continued to party, right? But we digress already, so I'll let you go back on track.
No, it's all good. Listen, I think I've mentioned this a couple of times in the podcast. Like people talk about their management styles and structures. And one we did recently, we had a guest who was speaking about applying their love for sport and that competitiveness. And I'm kind of similar that way as well. Like when it comes to applying football strategies or football management approaches towards cyber. I don't know if you do something similar in regards to your sports, but again, we can touch upon that later. But
well, let's touch right now, right? So I help manage my kid's football team. He's decent enough and plays in a good team, and I think I've applied my work management style to sport more than the opposite way around. And probably what I learned, maybe younger playing sport, is I think the best compliment you can get as a manager or as a director, as a VP, is that when you leave, nobody notices. And that sounds weird, but I think the greatest leaders are those that create a team and a culture and capabilities and competencies that mean that when you leave the door, for whatever reason that is, that it almost doesn't make a difference. And that's my striving, right? Multiple times I've ran teams and they said, oh, can you help us with this? And I've said no. And they're like, but you know how to do this. I'm like, I do. But I'm going to push you off a cliff and see what happens. I think that for me is real leadership. I think that, we can go down a whole cultural debate around how society has changed to much more of a kind of a spoon-fed culture in general than it was historically, even when we both grew up in the industries. But I think we teach resilience and we teach adaptability and we teach abilities to learn by kind of giving people that freedom to fail. And I think that's the same as you do on a football pitch, right? You can give kids or you can be given instruction, but as soon as you leave that sideline, coach's control is minimal at that point. He can just shout at you and hope that you listen. I think that's the key to, for me, real leadership is, like I said, giving someone instructions and confidence and then freedom to fail and getting to a point where they don't need you.
I absolutely agree. we should hopefully, as all cyber leaders or leaders in whatever respective industries, should be able to build foundations where people can fail fast, they can adapt quite quickly, and ultimately they can stand on their own 2 feet. And it's quite interesting. I know someone recently who left an organization, and he said the exact same thing. He's like, it's almost as if I was never there. I was like, it's because you did your job correctly. You've set people up, and now they're carrying the metaphoric baton. But talk me through. Yeah, I'd obviously clocked that you'd mentioned you'd been pen testing as well.
Yeah.
Kind of talk me through how you get into that, then that kind of transition up to obviously being a CISO, and what does a field CISO mean?
Right, there's a few questions one pick there. My background again is even more varied inside of that. I wasn't a natural student of like computer science and technology and coding and stuff. I actually studied Chinese at university randomly.
Wow.
And then ended up in KPMG's technology acquisition branch. So almost like more like M&As around the tech and cyber space. When they then started to build out or strengthen their northern cybersecurity team, and basically internally asked, did anyone want to give it a go and do a hack the box and prove their skill set? Now, I grew up playing with computers. My dad was a big computer nerd. We grew up with a kind of weird Amstrad Mega Drive switching thing and Ataris and ZX Spectrums. And I think I started learning to hack as a kid, trying to work out how to cheat on games more effectively. So I think it was always kind of, I think it's in your DNA sometimes, that desire to find a way around the problem, to find a solution in some way. So I put my hand up and hacked, quote unquote, the box, and ended up then taking a pen testing and kind of learning, I suppose, organically and on the fly, by self-tuition, by problems, by the web resources that are available to everybody now. So that's kind of how I got into it, fell in love with testing. But for me, it was always more about people. Like I fell in love with logically testing fine, and web app testing fine, mobile app testing, great. But it was the people that fascinated me. It's your ability to it sounds really dark as a statement, but your ability to manipulate people, like your ability to control an environment and to find, like I said, that kind of, if you've ever done much physical pen testing or much social engineering, that kind of heart and mouth moment that you can't get on a keyboard. When you're like, I don't really know what's going to happen next. Nobody here knows what I'm actually officially contracted to do, and I could end up in all kinds of trouble. So I think that's part of it. From there, like I said, the CISO path was natural. I kind of moved across. I got asked to go and work on some GDPR technology-related GDPR incident, which was based out in the Middle East. From there, then ended up staying in kind of what we call RM and Geo risk management and governance, GLC type consulting work, doing a lot of VCISO work in Silicon Valley. So living out there and building up companies from nothing to being able to get to an ISO and a SOC, and then hiring a CISO and moving on. Eventually, I did a piece of work at a company called MemSQL, which is now called SignalStore, big database company. Showed that they had all kinds of vulnerabilities, human and logical. And the then CEO, Nikita Shamaganov, who's still a close friend of mine to this day, basically said, do you want to come and try and fix it? That's how I ended up there. I spent, like I said, a number of years jumping around CISO roles, advisory roles. My current role at as a field CISO is an interesting amalgamation of the things that I've managed to learn in life, like as a career. So I guess if you work in a lot of security vendors, which I have as the CISO, and you've also bought a lot of security products, you learn how to sell to security leaders. So you learn what works and what doesn't work, and you gain hopefully some degree of credibility in the industry, both from a thought leader perspective, but also from being a decent human being perspective. And so at Anecdotes, I kind of have that bi-directional advisor role, advising the business internally, like what should we do? What's the right things to do product-wise? What's the right things to do strategy-wise? Like how should we be messaging? Who should we be messaging? And on the other side, like actually helping lead and drive a go-to-market machine to build like, not just like sales and pipe, but to build real meaningful like growth mechanisms.
Yeah.
Which I find interesting, right? It's different. I've never been on this side of the fence before. I'm really driven by like sales indicators. I mean, that's the thing that's really fascinating. But gosh, it's a pressured world. It's given me a whole new respect for salespeople that I used to just kind of dismiss so quickly. I'm now like, oh, I feel bad actually. I should listen to you. But yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting turn of fate. I don't know if I'll always stay in this kind of field CISO role, but for now, it's definitely which I found really interesting. It's given me chances to grow and develop that I wouldn't have if I'd always just stayed in the standard quote unquote CISO chair.
Yeah, and I think it adds a whole different dimension to things. It's a lot more varied. As you said, you're on kind of both sides, and also you kind of get a newfound respect for salespeople because I think that's the number one thing, or two things that CISOs moan about is either recruitment or salespeople.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear that different take on it. And then moving into like challenges that you face within the industry. Just talk me through some of them.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to take a couple of minutes and talk about today's sponsor, which is Vanta. Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Through my experiences of using Vanta, Vanta automates compliance. It covers everything from SOC 2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, and many more, saving you time and money, while helping you build customer trust. I love all the insights that it gives me, covering everything from asset management, my control failures, audit status, even vulnerabilities from other connecting systems which have been integrated into the platform. Having a centralized place for something like an ISO program has been a godsend for me. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Why Vanta? With over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Flow Health, and Quora, they all use Vanta to manage risk and provide security in real time. So, my listeners can claim a special offer of $1,000 off Vanta at vanta.com/decloaked. That's vanta.com/decloaked. Thanks.
Look, I think there's always challenges in any industry. So I'll give you some of my kind of personal career ones and then some broader kind of, I suppose, industry-based challenges. I think geography is a challenge in itself, right? So I spent most of my working life living in the UK where my family's happy and comfortable, working in the US. So I spent a lot of time on weird time zones, right? My day can start at lunchtime and finish at 10 or 11 p.m. I also now work for an Israeli company who sells predominantly into the US. So I have like a morning time zone, then a slight gap, and then a crazy like afternoon again. So I think time zones is always a challenge, right? And if you have to find a way to make your working life work in where you are most effective. I found that in the American market, I'm more effective and more geared to that than the UK space is still, I suppose, almost kind of white spacey to me in a way, since it's been so long since I really worked in the UK. So I think finding where your skills are most applicable and making a way to make that work is important. But there's challenges that come with that. I think last year I spent 15 times transatlantic before we include any other flights. And that's fairly normal. So I think that there's parts of that. I think also there's pressures in the CISO world and CIO world now, which there haven't been before. Like, it's such a quickly broadening role with sharpening expectations that you wouldn't find in any other C-suite. Like, you don't find the CRO being asked, like, can you work out how to like design a product roadmap? Like you don't find like the CFO being like told to like work out how to improve RevOps. Like, these are all things that like, whereas the CISO and quite often now inheriting IT has become whatever else we haven't, whoever it doesn't fit into is probably yours. So like, it's become so broad. And like, you've now, because everything's now cloud-based and SaaS-based, you've inherited the security basically for the whole business. You used to just be like, manage the DC and like secure the perimeter. Whereas now it's like, every app in the business is now yours because they're connected by API to our main infrastructure. So everything's your relevance. And I'm like, well, that's intense. And I think there's also now, there's the personal liability conversation we go into, that particularly, so again, I work in US entities, that like, you are technically personally liable. I mean, SolarWinds was an interesting one that the Supreme Court overthrew SEC's findings, but not all of them, right? They still claim that he's, and I know the guy, they still claim that he's liable for having a security policy that he shared with customers that he was not directly upholding. Now, like, again, if someone says to me, have you got a password policy in place? Yes. Do I know in 100% of instances that password policy is in place? Like,
Yeah.
do you know what I mean? Like, you're on the hook and line for a lot of things that no one else really would before. So I think that's one. I think as an industry, we're now trying to work out what's going on. So we spent years talking about the skills gaps, and we've got too many jobs, not enough people. But this year, the whole world's turned its head, and I know multiple very experienced, very successful CISOs who've been out of work like twice in the last like 7 months. I know people who can't find work in our world. I'm going to say they can't both be true, right? You can't have a skill shortage and you can't have a supply shortage and a demand shortage at the same time. So I think we've got to work out exactly what the problem there is. Is it the fact that we're not defining recs well enough? Is it the fact that we're putting too much pressure and expectation on CISOs and security leaders, so we're cycling and churning them very quickly? Like, where is the problem? Is the CISO role, CEOs need to decide, is the CISO role a nice to have or a need to have? Because it seems like some of the ones that I know that are being churned because they're a nice to have in difficult economic times. But that's a real concern for me for anyone who operates in or with technology. So I think that's one of the challenges. The other thing we've got to work out is like, what do we really think? I think is one. Like, what do we think are the key challenges? Because there's it's good to have varying opinions, but again, to go to harp on the same point, CISOs are so different. Security leaders and security people are so different. Whereas they're not really, if you're in the finance world, they're not really in the sales world. We all hold such different views on what matters right now, and how we should go about it. And I think that's really key. You can bring up problems like machine identity, which is one of my spaces, AI, which I'm in, but is a massively much bigger topic. We could harp on about CrowdStrike, I'm sure we will, for like long points about it. So we need to work out kind of what we think matters, and then we need to get community. Like, it drives me mad that like we're all like, and I will get onto this, I'm sure. We're all attacking CrowdStrike, right? I'm not going to defend there wasn't an error. And I'm not going to defend that optics around a $10 gift card aren't great, but that's a very successful company for a reason. And no one ever had an outage before and offered everyone $10. Every single person ever worked on it, right? So yes, it doesn't look great, but it's better than anyone else has ever done before, right? So, and at the same time, we have a breach on SolarWinds or whatever it might be, and we throw the whole guy we'll throw whoever the CISO is under the bus. We did the same with Uber. Oh, he's lied, he's cheated on SolarWinds. How did he miss that? Or like Equifax, how did they not see that like update required? Like, we get to the point where we defend each other. Like, stop attacking each other and start defending. Because our culture has now become so like toxically dangerous that like any out of step and there's someone ready to go for you as a wolf. So I think that's one. And then transparency for me. Again, we could talk about this a lot, and it's one of my. I come from Wistit, which is a vendor risk management company, and I sit now in a GRC automation company, both of which were big on the transparency point. And I want to get to the point where we accept things aren't perfect. Like, why do we always need a trust center that's fully green? Why do we always need an audit report that's fully clean? Like, why do we need an ISO report with no findings? It's not reality. Like, I want to get to a point where we share reality so we can build relationships with our vendors and our customers based on the trust of what they're doing well and the things they're working on with open eyes. So it's not just us helping the lawyers find liability clauses in case anything goes wrong, because that's not a sustainable future for cyber. That's me rambling. But go ahead and pick wherever you want to go.
No. I like it. You know, obviously I haven't had a chance to speak about CrowdStrike. You know, they, again, as you said, they're very successful for a reason. You know, updates, issues happen. I think it's highlighted how dependent an update is, you know, globally. You know, how many times have we seen Heathrow Airport have an IT outage? And it's like, not a single comment from them, not a single, like, listen, that disaster recovery issue, you know, whatever it may be, nothing. And it's like, obviously CrowdStrike are making this massive approach towards, you know, they're probably very conscious that there's going to be liability, there's going to be claims made against them. They've obviously tried to take the edge off that by offering a gift voucher, which if you had a total of these vouchers, probably would range hundreds of millions.
Oh, I'm sure it does.
To give away. You know, then on the other hand, you had No B4, who come out and said, hey, we had someone come very, very close to being employed that was actually part of a North Korean, I don't know, was it an...
Yeah, that was interesting. Yeah, that was a fascinating one.
Yeah, but again, if a company puts their hand up and says, listen, we messed up, really sorry, or goes into great details about hiring or something like that, North Korean hacker, I think the community, back to that, what you just said, the community, it's like perpetuated through this social media thing where everyone's judgmental and willing to attack. You know, I remember, I think when MongoDB had an issue and I posted on LinkedIn, and that kind of I was like, you have no idea the stress these people are going through. They're working non-stop. You know, subsequently, some changes, I think, happened in our organization as well. I think 2 weeks prior to their incident, I think they pulled 23, 24 GRC roles that would predominantly probably test control functions and everything else. And it's like, you know, I think people are on social media now just for clicks and just want to kind of make cyber more toxic for whatever reason that they're trying to justify. And you're right, you know, everyone should be banding together and saying, is it a major inconvenience to the world? Absolutely. You know, I think flights resumed the following day, so, you know, maybe you need to stay an extra night in a hotel. It's easier said than done. But when they kind of detail the extent of how it happened, they've kind of detailed the timeline, you know, all the fixes and everything else, loads of other people jumped on it to say, are you a CrowdStrike customer? You know, we'll give you a 50% discount. And it's like, I can't be bothered with this, you know, the vendor pitches. But anyway, I'm going on a complete tangent about it as well. But
No, I mean, let's talk about some points, right, which I think are being overlooked. I think you're right. Clickbait is fascinating, and controversy is the key. Like, no one gets famous political kudos by saying, I don't like Donald Trump, right? Like, you have, like, those who want to drive noise have to say something argumentative and controversial, right? So I think number one is, like, no one can push a global update to CrowdStrike without being seriously senior in the business, right? And we've seen the timeline, we've seen the process, right? This isn't a nobody, this isn't some newbie who accidentally pressed the red button, right? There is a process in place that was still followed and somehow missed this, right? Simple fact. A logic error and why it was missed, there's more questions around what they've said versus what might be true, right? But that's beside the point. The reality is it's an error which happened. The things that I actually got from it are, one, a lot of us have probably caused a blue screen of death at some point. Our CEO, in fact, Kuznikov posted the next day about how he caused a blue screen of death at some point. Like, a lot of us have probably broke something at some point. Granted, I didn't break the infrastructure for the airlines across the globe, but still, like, we've all done something to some degree. And I saw a lot of those floating up with people kind of tallying on back, and I liked that. I think the second is, I was amazed how many people are still running critical infrastructure on Windows. Like, modern critical infrastructure. I couldn't believe that some of this new applications, like, how is that not on Linux? Why is that still on Windows? I couldn't believe that CrowdStrike was on the endpoints, like the NHS's MRI scanners, or like so many endpoints that made no sense. And then the other one is that we're all blaming CrowdStrike. Fine. Why was Delta not testing pre-prod updates? Delta Airline, like, this is, you've probably seen the map where there's all these crazy planes and over the space of 24 hours it disappears to nothing. I'm like, why did they not test this before it went out? Sometimes, like, you've got to, and I wonder where the liability lawsuit is going to fall, because I think there is probably a decent argument that Crouch says, yeah, fine, we've got some liability, but you should have tested it as well, and that's in your contract.
Which I think could open up, a whole new kind of form of standards, and also, again, case law will be made out of this, because you're absolutely right. Again, I can't really comment on Delta. They've dropped the ball a few times when it comes to IT. Again, a lot of these issues are probably caused because people at the top of their respective organizations simply cannot be arsed.
Yeah.
And, they're just like, whatever, we need to just keep everything moving forward. And it's like, I wish somewhere in the world where we just had a 1 week of tech debt, or just keep, modernizing technology so we don't have these issues, or we don't have like critical infrastructure relying on stuff that's decades out of date, but sorry, please, back to you, Jake.
No, I mean, that's my point, right? I think that this highlights, if nothing else, the fact that A, there's inadequate testing on the client side. B, there is inadequate understanding of production processes. And C, critical infrastructure is criminally underprotected. Like, granted, fine, they DR'd but like, the actual DR wasn't hard. You put it into safe mode, you removed a specific file, you reboot it. So why did it take them all like 24 hours? Like, why wasn't it quicker? That suggests that the DR processes were either not practiced and drilled, or it wasn't as simple as it probably should have been. So again, I think it highlights a lot of stuff actually on the buyer side, rather than, in this case, CrowdStrike as the seller, being from security and IT perspective, I found interesting. But yeah, I think that's one key thing. And then you kind of looked, the other one that's interesting, obviously, we touched on earlier, is like the SEC last week, when they had their over there. If anyone doesn't know, they obviously lodged personal findings against the CISO of SolarWinds for incompetency, manipulation, lying, various other things. And the Supreme Court threw out all of them but one, and said you can't find someone individually liable for these things. These aren't effectively in his JD to a degree. And there's no evidence of what you're saying, that it's kind of slander or hearsay. So I think that's really interesting as well, that now we're starting to see courts protecting. And I think that'll be interesting when we look at, I obviously work in a regulated space in the GRC world. I think you'll see now what this means in the future will be interesting, right? So NIS2 couldn't have got better marketing right now, because the entire global infrastructure for critical infrastructure crashed overnight when an IT shortage happened. So they've got some pretty strong branding to say you should probably protect your critical infrastructure. And NIS2 covers, like, I don't know why they call it critical infrastructure, because it seems to cover everything. It's like all of banking, all of healthcare, all of government, like education, like all of oil and gas, all telcos, all DCs, all cloud providers. It's most of everything that matters. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that comes in, and if that comes in with teeth or not, because that references individual liability again. But in Europe, we've not had to date an individual found liable for kind of cyber issues, and nor have we seen any of those things overturned because you haven't found someone to overturn to begin with. So I think that's an interesting area as well. Yeah.
Do you think, for someone who's in charge and responsible for cyber, do you think, like for CISOs, they're going to need to get some sort of a liability insurance? Do you think that will become a norm in like a year or two?
In the US, most of us do. I can't speak for UK
Okay.
CISOs. In the US, virtually all of us have personal liability insurance should anything happen, so we can call in our independent lawyers and say, if our company's not backing us, then we'll back ourselves.
Cool.
And that's exactly what happened in the SolarWinds case. That's not SolarWinds paying the legal fees. He was paying under his own personal insurance.
Wow. Well, which is quite interesting to hear, because obviously I'm UK based and, didn't really know the mechanics of it. And I'm interested, do you think that could evolve into something if there are more cases like Uber, SolarWinds, whatever else? Do you think there could be like a CISO's union? Is that a bit too batshit? What do you think?
I mean, unofficially, there sort of is. Like, there's things like the CISO Society and various other like Slack groups and community groups like Teammates or Merlin CISO Village. Like, there's lots of things there where like people like have these communities, and there is a lot of Chatham House rules conversations that happen inside of those groups that I can't really share, but like I think there is to a degree. There's just no centralized legal representation or centralized like kind of financial representation, which is what the characteristic mainly of a union. I don't know if you'll ever find it unionizing, basically based on the fact that at least a good 30-40% of CISOs come from a kind of technical hacker background and probably don't like the idea of unionization because it naturally doesn't speak to their kind of anarchist souls.
It's interesting. Again, if anyone's watching and they have any suggestions on this or any thoughts, I'd be quite interested in this, because listen, who knows where the world's going to go in the next few years? No doubt we'll have more war and we'll have a black swan event and everything else that comes with it. But anyway, we digress. So yes, the one topic you would like to discuss that you feel needs relevance or clearing up in the industry?
I think we need to talk about data for me. Like, again, I work in a GRC company where we're all about data and learning data from your GRC and security tools in kind of a Splunk-like way and making insights and automations based on that. But we have now gone through this crazy time of the last 2 or 3 years where we just bought tools for everything. And I was staggered to learn, there's a study done about a year ago that said that 50% of cybersecurity tools are not operationalized in the US. 50%. That represents probably hundreds of millions of dollars of spend that have never actually been used, because they're either bought to satisfy some kind of customer requirement, an audit requirement, like some kind of rationale that wasn't directly related to the actual security posture requirements at the time, and they've just never actually used them in any meaningful way. And then on top of that, you lay the fact that a lot of this stuff crosses over, like in the high connected activity style. Like, someone tell me where like ASPM versus CSPM versus like cloud security versus like where container security, like all of these different layers of like the cloud product or the cloud security landscape, there's overlapping all over the place. And then also there's so much data that come out of them that yes, you react to the alerts, and yes, you react to like the Slack channel messages saying you should do this or you should do that, and yes, you react to the Jira tickets to get created, but do you really have a meaningful way to react to and learn from the data? And I think it's interesting, like we talk a lot about how security is evolving, etc., but I feel like everyone else is better using their data than we are. Like sales to a granular T can tell you what you get for every dollar you spend and how you spend it, what will happen in respect to that, because they've just learned that over time. Like product to the T should be able to give you like to the minute, like kind of roadmaps or kind of like cycle times based on the evidence that they have. Marketing, again, like in-depth detail. Because I feel like in security, we produce a lot of information, but don't really know what to do with it. Like we've tried the kind of SOARs, but no SOAR really works, in my opinion. Splunk to Tableau doesn't seem to work as meaningfully for security tools as it does for other places in the business. I think we have a point where we've got to work out like, how do we use the data that we've got to drive meaningful outcomes? That's part one. And part two of that is, how do we make those meaningful outcomes translate to us being A, not a cost center, but a profit center, and be a meaningful voice in an executive boardroom versus being the reporter on the have we had any breaches lately? No. Are we meeting our security addendums? Yes. Thank you. Like, I think those two for me are the key things. Like, how do you change the data landscape, and then how do you use that to transform yourself in a meaningful business objectives way? Security for too long has been kind of a C title, but not a C role. And I think that's often because a lot of people who hold the chair aren't able to translate what they have and what they do into how that drives the business. There's simple ways to look at that, right? Like trust centers, classic example. Like if you hold your various security certifications, the details around them, you make it self-serve, etc., then you can speed up a sales cycle. So I'm cutting the sales cycle by X number of days, and therefore I'm enabling us to save X number of dollars from a sales perspective, right? Or maybe it's we reached a certain security posture and that enabled us to sell to customers of this genre, maybe Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, right? And that means that I've now actually generated X number of dollars. Maybe stuff like, whether it's the CISO personally or the security marketing, quote unquote, we do, how does that drive noise and traffic that lands into converted opportunities and or converted revenue? There's a lot of stuff that we do. How do we basically ensure, how do we reduce friction? Like, how do we build ourselves into the SDLC process to catch and to fix and remediate vulnerabilities prior to releases that would release in either customer dissatisfaction and or churn, or in delays, issues, and disturbances that may, again, cause us a loss of revenue and or customers. Like, you've got to try and find ways to translate what we do into meaningful outcomes for the business, and then support that with data. All of that data exists. We're just not very good at using it. I don't know why. Like that's the problem. Is the question is then why, and the answer is hard to find.
I love that comparison between various other areas that are like marketing's a prime example. I mean, they could tell you exactly when they launch a campaign, how many clicks, views, conversion, people on the user acquisition and life cycle and everything else. And we always talk about how we can utilize data towards like the exco or C levels or whatever else. Do you have any advice on how you could then use security data internally, like with people below that level? So again, an example of this would be you implement, I don't know, SDLC, you show the value of something like a SaaS and DAS tool. That means that you can do X, which equates to Y or reduces vulnerabilities. Is there any other kind of hints, tips that you would recommend to the audience that can utilize data internally to maybe gain more of a value or net gain when it comes to security?
I think you touched on one. So I think that security leaders and security teams need to be far better baked into development processes, and highlighting and having the technical competence and understanding to highlight and to address relevant vulnerabilities in that process. We can't just throw things over the wall every time it pops up in Sneak and or other security tools and say, can you fix this, please? We have to be able to effectively look at that, understand what it is, understand its criticality and its reality. Maybe it's not actually doing what it says it does. Maybe it's probably remediated or cross-remediated or something else. And then be able to relay back to any development, this is what needs to be fixed, and this is why, and this is how. And getting understanding and buy around that. I think the way you flip that is do a lot of kind of internal bug bounty hunter programs. So like everyone knows the external ones, like the bug crowd and the hacker one, that kind of stuff. But I like to run internal ones. So like, find me problems in our product that you didn't make. That's always the rule. Not stuff in your code that you didn't make, and then let's work to remediate them. And let's give points and let's give prizes based on people's ability to remediate those things. And I think that firstly enables people to get that mindset in of like trying to see the issues and prioritize them, but also it just changes culture. Like it makes security a part of how people think. Even if you just sit like an analyst in the room for every sprint cycle meeting, I think again, that's really relevant because it builds like security into the culture of a development team. So I think that's number one. I think the other one is actually is education. So I think we'll stick with the engineering team. If you're, I think every CISO and every security team should sit within engineering. If you're going to report anywhere, it should be to a CTO, because I think you should be technical. I think the security team has to see as an extension of their team. So I think that's a key point for me. Like there are lots of people who sit in these chairs that aren't technically backgrounded, and that's fine. But I think they have to be able to at least speak the language and convey the message. To the rest of the business, it's about understanding and education. So whether that's explaining what happened at CrowdStrike or SolarWinds or blah, 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 whatever common breach it is, or maybe it's explaining like the concepts of social engineering or how AI is going to change why we have to secure the business and how we have to secure the business, and educating people internally about why this stuff matters to them. And you can always give it like the personal and professional twist, which means you kind of engage people because you're offering them something that might help them in their personal life. This is why you won't get hacked in your bank account this year, for example. But this is also why knowing this might be beneficial to you in a conversation, like enable salespeople, regardless of what you sell. Security is probably involved in there in some respect because technology is probably involved in some respect. Similarly in marketing, like regardless of what you do, you're probably going to annoy somebody somewhere in the world at some point who's going to quote GDPR or something to you. So understand what they're quoting so you know how to speak back to them. Right. And I think then also if you go anywhere else in the business, you can talk about this, right? So like I said, you've got to be able to explain to a finance team why you spending $1 million on security tools is actually a net benefit. Like this enables us to have this certification. This enables us to be FedRAMP compliant, so we can sell to the US government and they'll give us $5 million, right? Great. Or this enables us to maintain our SOC 2 and our ISO. This is required because we sell to bank A, and if we don't, we lose their business. Or it's up to you what you want to do. So I think that there's a lot of places we can find ways to better do this internally. And I think you always have to, we come back to our first point, you have to have the data to back it up. So in the engineering team, you have to be able to demonstrate, here's the data of all the stuff, here's what we threw out, and here's the ones that we gave you, and this is why we've classified them as critical, and this is why we've been doing. So the finance team, here's the cost, here's the benefit, here's how I'm getting from A to B. To the wider business, like, here's the problem, here's evidence of why it's a problem, and here's what we and you need to do to remediate or to fix that problem. Like it comes back to that we have so much data, but we're not very good at turning it into stories. And I think that's the key, right? If you could teach any skill to anybody in the world, it doesn't matter what their job is, but particularly in security, it's that ability to tell a story, not to meander like a salesperson into the world of make-believe, but to actually take data and transactional events, quote unquote, and give them like a narrative that's convincing and meaningful.
I like that. And then one element you touched upon was the kind of internal side of something like gamification. You know, that everyone loves gamification, whether it's for bonusly points. If no one's ever heard of bonusly, check it out. It's a really good employee incentive tool. You know, whether it's vouchers, beers, pizzas, and then that kind of almost build your own mini hackathon.
Yeah.
And then that really kind of changes the culture. Then that creates a buzz, and that may go to non-technical audiences, and they then may peek their head in and want a piece of that action as well. And I think, again, back to your last point about storytelling is so vital. And I think it's quite easy just to dump data on people without actually capitulating that. So yes, and then our last topic then, Jake, will be the one thing in cyber you think is BS and needs a focus on or needs to change.
The guy spent a number of years in these podcasts talking about the skills gap, so I'm kind of fed up of saying that the skills gap is BS. So I'm going to pick something completely different. I think this is an interesting comment because like I said, I'm affiliated to Lasso, who's an AI security company, but right now, in many companies, AI is BS. Like they're not really doing anything with AI in a meaningful AI way. They might be using some algorithms or some machine learning technologies or processes, but it's not really AI. And AI security itself needs meaningful, significant data breaches to prove its value and worth in terms of what are the comparable and real attack vectors. And everyone knows that, right? There's not going to be real massive spend in AI security at a high level until we have some breaches that show us this is where the risks exist. So I don't think that AI or AI security per se is BS, but I think the way the industry is currently approaching it is very naive and almost a little bit nonchalant, like, oh, like it's AI, right? So, and I think the way that we as vendors are approaching it similarly, we're just making sure we have an AI story to tell, even if it's not meaningful to the product or the delivery of the service we're trying to give you. Like AI's got to, again, have a compelling narrative to why am I using it to solve this problem? Why is it making my product or the vehicle in which I deliver it better or more effective? If I'm direct AI security, what am I securing against? Back to data. Where's the data to say that this is a thing that I should secure against and that my security against this thing is effective? So I think for me, it's getting quieter than it was a year ago, but it's still very noisy. Like we need to kind of streamline it down to the message that says that this is how we as companies use AI and this is why. These are the AI security risks that exist internally, externally, in AI, because of AI. These are the products that can defend or protect against that, and this is why. And here's all the data to underpin everything I just said. Right now, it's a classic example of what we said when lacking data. People just saying AI and running around with their hair on fire and not getting anywhere.
Yeah. And how do we then kind of drill through all of that noise? Is there anything you would recommend?
I think you have to work it out yourself. Like I said, it's easy. Look, I'm not an AI expert, but I'm technical enough to understand the concepts of LLM and LLM security. And I think you have to do some research yourself to say, okay, I'm leading a business, let's say in this context. Where are AI technologies being used in my business? Do I know about them? How many of them are unknowns to me? Can I make those all known unknowns? Like, let's just make sure I tell everyone, we'll try and say yes to as much as we can. We'll put some guardrails and perimeters around it by saying what data you can and can't use in some kind of policy. And then we'll try and almost encourage people so I can get control of it. So it's not shadow. Right. So I think that's part one. Part two is then saying, what are the risks to me as a business? Like, do I have internal AI risk? Do I have external risk? Am I seeing an increase in social engineering? Like, do I use models internally that are now comparable? Like, am I able to look at injection? Am I using chat-driven AI bots where someone's going to try and buy a $1 flight, which happened? What am I doing to protect against those things? And then you go to the vendors and look. I think before going to a vendor, like, have conversations with people who are experts in this space, of which there are multiple, who will say, this vendor has a product that makes sense. This vendor doesn't. Like, this one works for this kind of company. This one works for that kind of problem. Work it out yourself and then go and find someone who's knowledgeable and a thought leader and an expert in the space to find some direction. But I would say right now it's take a slow and meaningful approach. Don't jump to trying to fix it today, because I don't think we're quite there yet as an industry to give a solution to fix it today.
Yeah, makes sense. And then obviously we mentioned earlier that you'd started a podcast. Now's your time if you want to plug it, give a description. Yeah.
I've been asked to start a podcast for a long time. I haven't been a guest on a lot of them now. And I called it Risking It All because I've spent a lot of time working in risk and talking about risk. And really, for me, it's kind of a meandering, non-structured conversation with people who I think are interesting. I did the first one with Jack Rumsey, who's the head of GRC at Swim Lane. I'm doing one in August with Mandy Andres, who is the CISO at Elastic and a pretty strong thought leader in all things security. And we're looking kind of at some core, I suppose, news debates at the time. Me and Jack went through CrowdStrike, SEC, and NIS2. With Mandy, we're talking a lot about data, this conversation we've had, and trying to focus on kind of personal and professional lives, how the way we have to or do deal with risk in our professional lives to CISOs and security leaders affects how we think and deal with risk in our personal lives. We joked about Jack just getting married as being biggest risk he ever took. And I think often, like, because I'm inherently quite risk aggressive as a security leader, it's made me probably much more risk aggressive in my personal life. I'm a big road cyclist, and I frequently realize that I'm heading down a mountain at like 90 kilometers an hour with a bit of like lycra and a bit of foam on my head. Like, I think that's an attitude that you start to culture inside of yourself. You're like, if I'm willing to risk like multi-million-dollar business on like a security breach that I hope I've patched against, I'm probably okay flying down a mountain. So yeah, it is what it is. It's very much an organic and evolving thing. I think we'll find out what works, what people like, what they don't like. But we had some good noise from the first one. So yeah, if you want to give it a listen, feel free. It's being hosted by InfoSec Live. If you don't know Simon Lindstead and his community, it's on YouTube and various other channels. And I'm happy for everyone to tell me it's terrible and tell me to take up a new profession.
Nah, I'm sure it's going to be grand, and we'll plug it as well within the Decloaked channel. And again, everyone, please like, sub, and share our podcast as well as Jake's, and get some decent traffic towards Jake's pod as well. And then yeah, maybe we'll get some sort of a obscure multiversal crossover. I've had a few people reach out recently about them, and it's like, I think it's just going to culminate in a big massive party online with a few hundred people on a Zoom call.
That'd be good, wouldn't it? If we all had like a giant, everyone got to ask one question from their theme or like direction of their podcast in like a round.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that'd be great. But yeah, absolutely. We'll see what happens then. And again, Jake, thanks very much for your time today. And everyone, again, please show some love for Jake and also his channel. And then, yeah, we'll speak soon.
Thanks, Leo. It's been my absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.